Yeah, so I think the big thing that people are going to be asking me is what I thought about the documentary. So I think the documentary was very interesting, and I think let me preface everything by saying like I respect what Samok's his work, the effort that he puts in. The recordings, the interviews that we've never seen before, and of course for the original Smash documentary, like I have nothing but respect for Samox. He has been a great guy, great interviewer. So like I don't want to come across as hateful or anything like that. It's not like this guy sucks but and I think the documentary was all right is like the best way I can put it. And I think the big issue that comes up is that the first documentary had such a good reception to it that unless this documentary was like perfect, like because people are already expecting, right, like a Samrock's documentary like has like this level of standard to it, right, based on the first documentary and the impact it's seen. um Unless, and then I think everyone will come into an image of what the next documentary should be, with everything that comes around, that I think we come in with this preconceived notion of what it should be, in this expectation that I don't think he can reasonably meet. And so with that being said, like I think the expectations do unfortunately lead to disappointment. And it's not to say like the doc. I don't think the documentary was like a 9 out of 10. I think it was just all right. There was a lot good. Episodes 2 and 3. Pretty solid. All around. I think the other episodes were okay. Like they definitely dragged in certain parts, and I think if I were to talk about this constructively, like what like kind of leads into the difficulty of making this documentary. So I want to give a little context. I know a lot of people already know, and this has been shared on Reddit, but like the original documentary, because we already had Mango, Hungrybox, and Mewtwo present in the first documentary, this was supposed to be a documentary that was focused on PPMD and Armada, like as like episodes 10 and 11. And then later that scope changed to let's make a featured film, presumably on PPMD and Armada. And then later it's like, okay, like there's a lot more material that we have here. Let's turn it into a Five Gods documentary. And then let's also toss Leffen in here. I think one of the hard parts about designing a documentary here is that it's impossible to have the absolute foresight in how the games will play out. And what I mean by this is when like because he started to create these episodes and he started filming and creating a vision for this documentary, I think in like 2013, 2014, after seeing the success of the first documentary, right? But if you look at 2014, you look at what happened, right? Like PPMD was doing really well. He was starting to win events. He had a pretty good arc to him. Now Armada was coming to the States more, so you understand like the Five Gods element is very likely gonna stay. And then all of a sudden, like out of the blue, you're not gonna like if you were back in 2013, would you have bet money that Leffen would have been the person that that ends up dethroning the Five Gods and beating all of them? Probably not, right? So when you create the narratives and you ask yourself like, who do I need to interview, what questions do I need to ask, it's so fluid because the vision that you have presumes a lot of things about the results and the successes of the players 1 to 3 years in the future, right? And so that's a difficult thing to really have to do, right? Like as you probably film and you create your content pieces, you're probably realizing, oh, like the way I envisioned, creating this documentary and the narratives that I want to present is different from reality, right? Like if the results come out dramatically different, let's say in the extreme case, like PP and Armada start, doing really bad in 2014 or 2015 as this filming is happening, then your original like storytelling, your timelines, your interviews all become kind of weird. But fortunately, they do well. But overall, I think what is difficult here is that as the scope began to change, like you have elements of pre-recording that you need to do that aren't there, right? So I'm pretty sure what happened with Samox is that as he was interviewing PP and Armada, he realized that Mango had to be a big element here because he was a big rival to them in that 2013 to 2015 time. And so like it would feel inappropriate to include them two but not mention much about Mango, so they include Mango in there. And then now you have three of these people, but now we have this narrative of the Five Gods that came up during that time. It's like, oh, like, well, it seems kind of weird to include these three, but not Hungrybox and Mutaking or make any mention of them. So this is a dilemma that I have with Smash related projects. It's often about scoping, and for example, when I do SSBM rank and I do the top 100 rankings, right, and we have to narrow down a list, right, the more you add to it, the more work you have to do, right? Like if we make the nomination list 160 people, some people can look, and this happens every time when I did the list, somebody's going to look at the list and go like, wait, what the heck, this player has been 3 people on the list. Why aren't you including this player, right? And so you include them, and then the list becomes 200 people, and then you're like, and then other people come out of the woodworks and say, like, why are they in the nomination list? Like, why aren't I on the list? And then it can become 250 people. So the issue of scope becomes an issue, and you can easily, in the realm of Smash, like, get into a world, no matter what the scope is, whether it's big or small, there's always going to be something or a criticism that's reasonably fair, where it's like, why didn't you include X? Why didn't you include Y? Right? Like in this, Apex 2014 and Big House 3 weren't included, right? But if you include those, then other TOs are going to go like, well, why didn't you include these other events? And so it's really hard to draw a defining line here. And I think that was the Sandbox's struggle here, was where do you draw the scope of this project? Who do you want to present? What tournaments do you want to cover? And what's your narrative going to be around? And I think because of the complexity of that and not quite nailing it, I think that's where the direction and the flow and the pacing of the Smash of the documentary tends to be a little bit slow and incorrectly paced for like to keep my attention, right? Because when you watch the later episodes, it feels like it's a list of events where yeah, this player won this tournament, go on to the next event, this player won this event, Armada won this event, right? And it just becomes a list, right? And I think that is the large issue with it, right? Is how do you go back and forth here, right? And I think Samok struggled with the fact. So this is the issue where things become a little bit more difficult to deal with in this documentary and not the first documentary. In the first documentary, Ken's kind of trajectory in the movie, in the documentary, in respect to MLG with like 04 to 07 is very different from Mutaking. So aside from like, they all like peak at different times, so it's very easy to clearly define like who is rising and creating a story of the rise of a certain player in the first documentary because of just like coincidentally how things panned out, right? First you had Ken and Azen who were really good, and then Mutaking started getting really good, and then PC Chris started getting really good, and then Mutaking started getting really good, and then Korean DJ started getting really good, and then Mango started getting like really good. So like it's very easy to pace out and sparse, like even though like the first documentary follows a timeline, right? You're progressing through MLG, you're progressing through 04, 05, 06, 07. The issue with this documentary and the timing of things is that everything is happening in parallel, right? So if you want to do a defined like player by player episodic content for the gods, right? A lot of their stories happen in parallel, and that becomes an issue, right? Because you follow PPMD's trajectory, right? It like, and you talk about the events that PPMD goes through in one episode, right? Well, the issue is that Armada's trajectory follows a very similar path of peaks and timings, right? So all these storylines, like unless you repeat the events over and over and over again, and you go back and you flash back to events, like it's like, oh, like I want to mention Evo 2014 for this guy, and then on the next episode you're mentioning Evo 2014 again, and then in the third episode you're mentioning Evo 2014 for 3 of the different gods and what they meant. It becomes repetitive and redundant, and so the storyline to do episodic content based on individual players means you have a lot of repetition because a lot of the events interconnected with the progression of each player, so that ends up becoming difficult, right? And so from Sandbox's direction, I feel like he went with let's kind of create this like episodic content based on each of the gods individually, where each god has a different focus in each episode, but while trying to progress a timeline of the events that happened between like 2010 and 2015. The issue here is because they're so interwoven, like the narrative is just going to be messy. Like it's going to be very confusing. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. And so like what do you do as Samox here? And I think that's like a really tough decision. Because I think he would have actually done the narrative, the documentary would have actually, in my opinion, would have been better if it had just focused on PP and Armada. And if if you went with just PP and Armada, you kept the scope and you let the audience know, like, hey guys, like I understand that Mango, Hungrybox, Mutant King, and Laughing are all important to that era, but just for this documentary, we're just gonna focus on PPMD and Armada. Like, I think this documentary, with the amount of content that he got from PPMD and Armada through interviews, going to North Carolina and Sweden, like I actually think the focus would have been really good. And I think the best analogy I can give here is when you watch like Iron Chef or something, and you see a person that's a little bit too ambitious with the number of dishes, and so they make like six like all right dishes. One of them maybe stands out, but that doesn't show as much of a strong the overall presentation to the meal as opposed to just bringing out 2 to 3 really strong dishes, right? um and so, but however, I also see the dilemma here, right? Like if you like PP and Armada, right? Like they are exciting characters and exciting people and players and competitors to the Melee scene. And I understand that the like talking about the five gods in the platinum era of Melee is just a strong thing, right? And the criticism that could have happened, let's say like Scamox knocks it out of the park with just an Armada and a PP content, right? Like then people are gonna go like, well, why the hell didn't you talk about Mutant King? Why didn't you talk about the Return of the King with Big House 3? Why didn't you talk about Honeybox? Why didn't you talk about Mango? Mango got shafted, right? And so there's like no winning for Sandbox here, because if he did just those two players, like the audience is just gonna be like, why didn't you do more? And that's kind of the dilemma that you have in Sandbox's position of like how to scope this. And I think in hindsight's always gonna be 2020, right? We look at this now and we say like maybe we should have cut down the scope here. But you know, if the opposite happened where it ended up being good for a few episodes, and we would have said, why didn't you expand the scope? You did such a great job. Why didn't you do more episodes? And so that is kind of like my take on the scope of it and the issues that come up with it. I also think in the other planning and production, right? Like I think there was the hard thing to balance here, right? Is the people who have watched this documentary are very likely going to be on the spectrum of people who are very into Melee and very intimately know like the details of these events. They know like the results of the events. They know that Mango had a really good run in 2014. We know about Apex 2015. We know about like the Salty Suite. I think there is a very big difference between how we are going to perceive the documentary and a person who has no context to what Melee is going to perceive it, right? And I think a lot of things that like I have to examine it, right, is I think we're making a lot of assumptions and we're almost projecting our ideas of how does the casual audience view this, and that's something I don't have a full answer to. But I think a lot of the worries we have about the documentary, I think a lot of the casuals or people who don't know Melee honestly have a very different takeaway from watching this documentary than what we do. And I think from the expert standpoint, like we're going to be disappointed in many aspects, but for casual people who don't follow Melee that religiously, like they're not going to see those things. They're going to just see the overarching themes, and like those are the takeaways that are going to come out of this. For what it's worth, like a lot of the people thought like that I talked to that aren't Melee like enthusiasts thought that Mango was presented pretty well. They saw him as this guy that was very talented, worked, you know, had a magical aura to him, was kind of a jerk, and most of them didn't actually really talk about the slur, which was actually like pretty surprising to me, because I felt like out of anything that was going to be the thing that was like the elephant in the room of like, this is the painfully obvious thing that we need to talk about. Most of them didn't even remember it, or like, you know, it didn't leave a lasting impression for them. But with that being said, I think the other angle, and this is the other issue that I do have with the documentary, is when I leave I think when I leave, and again, like I don't think every documentary has to do this, but like when I watch like The Last Dance or watch another documentary, when I watch something from another scene, usually the net result is that I feel inspired to learn more about the scene or be a part of it, right? And I think that's the magic of what the original Smash Bros. Documentary did, was that like even though I was already in the community, like I just felt this energy of like yeah, like I really want to be a part of this, or I'm glad to be a part of this community. Or again, I'm pretty sure for a lot of people, the framing, especially episode 9, where it shows like the Smash, the Spirit Bomb, Evo 2013, the Nintendo cease and desist, and the community coming together, and people just sharing their stories and experiences. Like you leave the first documentary very inspired to do things, to be like, yeah, like I can be the next great player, or like Melee is so cool, like community is so cool, like I want to go to a tournament, or like I used to play Smash with my friends, like maybe I should pick up my controller and see what this is all about. And it brought a lot of people into the community because they fundamentally felt inspired to be a part of this. um and I get that the overall motif, or like the theme of the original Smash Bros documentary, is you look at these first people, you look at these gods, right? Like these top players that ruled Melee, right? And you look at the game in the sense of individual accomplishment and this journey to becoming the best. And then it quickly juxtaposes in episode 9 and says, even though we have these individuals that we celebrate and love to watch, they each bring their own style that we all celebrate. We can easily identify as players, you know, whether it's Music King's robotness or Korean DJ's creativity. Like we're all rooting for them. But at the end of the day, what really makes the game flow and makes the competitions exciting is the community and bringing people together, right? That is the theme that you get leaving that documentary. With this documentary, the direction seemed to be a lot about, hey, we have these gods that we put on pedestals. However, I want to show a very human element to these guys, that the gods, they are good at the game. They have impressive accomplishments, but at the end of the day, they are still human. That is the direction that I feel that Sandbox went for this new documentary, the Metagame. However, I think the issue that comes with this is that it almost feels grungy. I'm not sure if that's like the perfect word to describe it, but I don't leave the documentary really feeling inspired, right? And I feel like the connectedness that comes through this is this, right? Like I feel like the lasting impression should be out of this documentary is that despite the fact that there are gods that exist in Melee that are seemingly unbeatable, there are people that can come up and show that the gods, you know, are beatable, right? And I think the path in the arc that would have been really, really strong to leave with is the fact that with practice and dedication, like you too can be Leffen. You too can be the God Slayer. You too can do like all these great things, is like the message that I think a lot of people, like I think factually, like even if you look at, let's like take a step back, I feel like a lot of people who were rising through the scenes through Melee watch Leffen, and granted he was kind of a jerk at the time, like the fact that like Leffen was beating these people who we thought were impossible to beat, like I think inspired a lot of people to go like, yeah, like these people are beatable, like I can learn to beat them, I can learn their patterns, I can learn how to outplay them, I can do the things that they do. And I think if it created that theme, then it would be really, it would be, I think it would have been really great. Instead, you get this depressive thing, right? Where it's like depressing to see these. It takes the opposite angle, right? Where like it's humanizing the gods, right? Like, but it is also saying like it's not celebrating that these gods can be defeated. It's like this depressive undertone of, oh my gosh, these people that we put on pedestals, they're mortal, right? And I felt like that was like a weird take to that, where whenever Leffen won, there was this depressive motif that was going on. It was kind of like funny. It was like kind of memed. Like the moment you heard sad music, you instantly knew that Leffen, you know, was gonna win the set, or if it was happy that like the non-Leffen person was going to win. I didn't think that motif was really that good. And I think you could portray a villain, right? Like, I just wanted you to picture something like when Vegeta in Dragon Ball comes onto the scene. Vegeta, who is was the villain in the beginning of Dragon Ball Z, like you can instantly, I'm sure many of you guys can hear the theme of Vegeta's like music that comes in whenever Vegeta enters a scene, all right, or when Vegeta comes and makes a speech, right? And like villainy doesn't have to be this sad, grungy thing. It could be cool, right? Like you can have a cool villain. The villain doesn't have to be sad. In Final Fantasy VI, you know, Kefka wins, right? Like, and it's like an interesting take on the villainry, like just to show you that like the villain can be portrayed in many different ways. And I just thought the direction was a little bit strange. So that's like a big thing. And then I think these are like the kind of the minor like editorial things. I'm not gonna say they're minor in terms of like they're trivial, but like these are like the quick edits that you can make, right? Zero was bleeped out of or blurred out in like the Big House 4 scene, right? And then you just saw this inconsistency, right? Where where you saw these other people that have been outed um for one reason or another for things that they've done. And then you see them in different tiers, right? Like in I'm going to speak on the different tiers of how they were present, right? There's one where they're in the background, right? They are walking around the venue in the B-roll, right? Like you see these people, you're like, "Oh, wait, like isn't that the guy that did this?" right? And then you have people who have, talking segments or like mention of them, where like Armada casually mentions Zero and training with him at Sky House, right? That's like another kind of type of mentioning these people. And then third, you have the commentary, right? Where certain commentators who have been outed as, abusers, are for whatever reason having a big presence in the scene. So I'm going to talk about it in different tiers, right? Like I don't think it's that much to ask, and I think this is where Samox could have had like a viewing, like a pre-screen to kind of like iron out these kind of things, where we can just give him a list, like say like at like 6 minutes and 42 seconds, you see these guys, can you blur them out? At like 15 minutes, can you blur them out? Can we use a different line? Understanding that these interviews were done like multiple years ago, and he probably completed the first version, like multiple versions of the documentary before all these stories came out, right? So maybe it's too hard late to ask, but I think the blurring, I don't personally think that that is that difficult to do. Like, I think the hardest part here is like, what do we do with the commentary? The commentary, like, right, like, do you just play music over it? And the way I feel about it is this: people who aren't familiar with the scene are very unlikely going to understand that that was D1's voice. So is D1 getting glory or redeemed from the documentary showing match footage and commentary that features his commentary? Very likely not. The people who already don't identify that as D1 aren't going to know that's D1, or they're not going to be like, "Oh, who is this charismatic commentator just doing these really weird these really cool pickups in the commentary? Like, I would love to meet him." Right? That's not like, no one, like, I feel like most people aren't going to come to that place. I could be wrong, right? um and then, but the flip side of it is that the people who all know who he is, who are very familiar, are very likely going to know, like, okay, this guy did some stuff, right? So I don't think it adds to his the glory of those respective people. It doesn't bring honor. Now there are certain segments that are a little bit weird. I think the DJ Nintendo scene could have been removed. I think it was at Justice, and some pan ups could be replaced with other B-roll. The issue comes up is that you can't just replace it after, because one of the reasons why this took so long was that he got permission from everybody, and for people who were featured in the documentary, he had everybody sign like a liability waiver or whatever, like an appearance waiver that says that we're okay with having our faces on camera, or that the tournament had permission. So that's like kind of like the weird thing, and I think that is pretty fixable. I think the other things, and this is something, a lot of people are, they're on the spectrum of like where they feel about this, is like the way that I guess Milk Tea and PPMD's girlfriend were present. I think on one hand, like if PPMD generally feels like the relationship affected him, right? Or like learning from the relationship affected him, like I do think that there is some degree of importance for him, that he would probably feel like it's important to note that that was part of his journey, and to skirt that completely kind of would probably feel inauthentic to PP. On the flip side, like there are people who can interpret that relationship and go and paint PPMD's girlfriend in negative light, right? And then that could bring up this association that, like, oh yeah, PPMD's girlfriend caused PPMD's depression, right? So therefore, PPMD's girlfriend is bad, right? And that may be an unfair portrayal, and might be damaging to her image, right? Where that's like not favor. That concern could exist, right? And I understand people could see the potential of that being a liability issue. There was also the mention that like milk tea was like a trophy, right? Like Mango had to win for milk tea, quote unquote. Um, for me, like personally, the way I interpreted that PPMD relationship is like the way I take away. Of course, I'm gonna have a biased perspective because I know a little bit more details about the relationship. Is that like like the way I felt that it was present was it was talking about the relationship and how he learned from it, right? And the point I like to bring up is that there are relationships where you can have two very functioning humans, right? Where it just doesn't end up working out. And it doesn't mean that either party was bad. It was just two incompatible player. It was two people who were just incompatible with each other, and that incompatibility led to like toxic behaviors. Right? So again, I think the milk tea stuff, like all those are valid concerns, but like when I talk to people who watch the documentary that aren't familiar with Smash, they're not taking away that milk tea is being objectified here, right? Like when I ask people and they go like, "Hey, like what do you think about that?" It was like, "Oh yeah, I thought it was fine." Like, and I almost feel like it is reading into too much on how people might interpret things, as opposed to like just asking people, hey, like what did you think about this, right? Is the interpretation that I'm getting here matching what other people think, or is it just a big assumption that I'm making on behalf of other people, right? And to me it almost feels like it's like over policing. Of course, you can disagree with me what do you want, but like it's like me worrying about like a kid watching a it's me worrying about how a kid is going to interpret a movie, right? And I go like, "Hey, like what do you think about this?" right? Like or like but like they may not like pick up on any of that, right? But I do understand that there is a potential that people can think of it that way as dehumanizing or sexist. Um Again, like so I can see the possibility of that. I just don't really fully see that that is going to be the natural reaction that most people are going to see. Um, so that's like my take on those things. Like again, like I think there's some editing that could be done. I think that's relatively low hanging. Um, I guess like to like kind of close some of my like other thoughts on the documentary. I think the hard part here is I don't I don't leave the documentary with closure. Like I think um I think episode 9 in the original Smash documentary wrapped up everything really well. I thought it was a really good episode to wrap things up. I didn't really get a sense of closure for this documentary. So it's like really hard to really say um to say that like this this is my um like this is what I take away from it. I think I leave a little bit unsettled or unresolved um in all this. So I think in short, like if I were to give you my points, right? Like what do I think of a documentary? I thought it was alright. There's I think for me, like even in this video, like um I feel like I'm nitpicking at issues. I think there was a lot of things that were really good. I think there were a lot of segments that were really strong. I thought a lot of the interviews were really good. Um, and so I feel like I'm almost being a little bit too nitpicky here. Like I thought it was like a solid watch. Am I gonna say like it matched number one, like the original Smash documentary? No. And I think the scoping and the pacing just presented a large issue to following it. I think there are like a good handful of low points. There's some of the editing decisions with like how some women were depicted. Um, um, like some abusers, the slur that Mango used. I think those are easily fixable. Like, I don't think it's the end of the world, although those were present in the, first viewing. Like, I think those are very fixable things. Um, but, so yeah, like, I leave with like thinking it was just like it was all right. That's I think like the takeaway that I have with it.